Job chapter 1. Job chapter 1, page 336 in the Pew Bibles. And same thing as Sunday, I do have the doors locked, just in case somebody knocks on the door wanting in or something like that. So Job chapter 1, this is going to be obviously somewhat different for the most part from how I typically preach on Sunday morning. If you recall back to last summer and what we did there, basically similar, just studying along with it. Not necessarily illustrating it per se, but just information on it. So it's not necessarily meant to be entertaining per se or convincing, although it can be both of those. It's not necessarily meant to be boring either, but there's a lot of information within the book of Job, and we're trying to concise it down and explain it, understand it, see how it builds and contributes to biblical doctrine that we have, as well as personal and corporate applications that we might draw from the book of Job. Absolutely, by all means. And I'll try to get to them as best I can, and if I can't, we'll work them from there depending on how it needs to be. So the goal tonight is to cover the first 5 verses, Job 1 through 5. The title of tonight's lesson will be taken straight from that first phrase there was a man. Historical narrative that we are being told about the life of this man. So for the next 13 weeks, this is what I've got it planned out to be with the references there. And so I'll get to the homework portion at the end. Let's put it that way. First, we're going to deal with some of the preliminary items when you start a book, all those details that you got to cover and everything like that nobody particularly enjoys per se, but we will cover them, not in any particular order. But the first one I want us to look at is this: who wrote Job? Who wrote Job? There's 5 main probabilities or possibilities that have been suggested through the years. The first one is Solomon, because of the contributions of Solomon, of course, to Ecclesiastes and Proverbs and all those wisdom literatures. The wording and some of the way that he writes and everything is very similar in the book of Job to how Solomon wrote in many of those other places. So Solomon is listed as a possible author, although at the same time, regarding the Hebrew language that it would have been written in, Moses is another author that's been suggested due to the similarities to early Hebrew texts and how that all works out, as well as similarities between Moses and Job and their suffering and their leadership and whatnot that they did. Although we don't get a whole lot into Job's leadership per se, it's pretty seemingly evident that that is the case. Another suggestion is that it was just an Israelite scribe of unknown name that was educated enough, he was knowledgeable enough in language and poetry, etc., because we do have a lot of poetic portions in here. So someone that was familiar with all those cultures, Israelites, Edomite, Mesopotamian culture and literature. Obviously, would have had to have been a scholar or a scribe of some higher learning, maybe, in order that he might be able to write in such a sophisticated style, into such depth. Fourth option is Elihu. So in Job 32, some of the context and wording that Elihu uses in responding and speaking to Job, it's strange how it's worded based on what we were expecting from all the previous versions of people talking to Job, such that has given some people thought that maybe Elihu actually wrote the whole book, and then that section in 32, he just steps out of his character, if you will, to identify himself as the writer. There's some. And of course, then there's others that it's simply another anonymous author. Someone else that we don't know of that wrote it, which is highly possible. We have no idea who on earth actually wrote this account down. So, with that being said, number 2, when did the events of Job occur? There's 4 main views The first is that it is, or I should say, we're going to work these in the order of least likely to most likely kind of thing. So least likely would be the exilic or the post-exilic period. That would be the latest date suggested sometime between 6 and 400 BC, which would have been around the time of Daniel, after the Babylonians area. So he would have been either a contemporary of or after Daniel. The themes of suffering and restoration, along with the experiences of the Jewish people during that time, would be similar. When you come to Ezekiel 14:14, it mentions Noah, Daniel, and Job in that order. Noah, Daniel, Job. And so if Job came after Noah and before Daniel, you would expect it to say Noah, Job, Daniel, not Noah, Daniel, Job. So some rely that, hey, maybe this is a hint that this actually occurred during this time frame. It's possible. Fourth option is that it could have occurred during the Solomonic era, during the time of Solomon, simply with the poetic style being very similar and how they were written in all that time frame. Others consider him to be a contemporary of Moses. Jobab is mentioned in Genesis 36 and 1 Chronicles 1, and some consider that Job is actually Jobab from that section. That would make him the great-grandson of Esau, and thus alive sometime around the period of the Exodus time frame. So that is one possibility. Another possibility, and in the one that I would hold to, the one that the great majority of everyone holds to, is that Job occurred sometime during the period of the patriarchs, sometime around that time. The setting of his life, the customs resemble that of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in that time period. The absence of any reference to the Mosaic law. There's the way that Job sacrifices for his family, how his wealth is recorded as being measured in livestock in his household as opposed to any other types of silver and gold, etc. The lifespan of Job factors in there. So all of those seemingly random details kind of point us to the patriarchal period, sometime in that time frame. So those are the first two. Number 3, I want us to look at some various themes within Job. Various themes within Job. Job has been studied and had extensive analysis done on it by everybody in every generation forever, it seems like. It's a very unique book. You could probably pick whatever topic you wanted to pick, and you could find it and somehow find someone that agrees with you that Job is about that topic. That being said, there's many themes that come to the forefront in Job, and understanding those themes should help us as we work through the book of Job. But best I can tell, I kind of narrowed it down here to give us maybe an overarching theme. Rather than simply the problem of suffering or God's sovereignty or something like that. I've kind of put it into a sentence form, and that is, the overarching theme of Job might be considered this: the back and forth nature of humanity, in other words, the battle, the war within our minds, the back and forth nature of humanity as it relates to the goodness of the divine and the difficulties faced in suffering. And how we in our minds go back and forth, struggling with the difficulties we face here on earth and as we suffer, all while knowing that God is good and preeminently He is merciful and compassionate and graceful, and how we juggle and find a middle ground of balance between those two things. I believe Job kind of presents that to us. And if I go too fast on any of the slides or anything like that and you want that information, please let me know and I'll put it up again or give you the sentence or whatever it is. But as far as the themes that come within Job, I've narrowed down 5 specifically here. The first being the problem of human suffering. The book of Job simply addresses the question of why righteous people suffer. It helps us to understand God's goodness despite the existence of evil and suffering. It reveals to us a compassionate aspect of God who's aware of human suffering and responds to human suffering, even though that response to suffering may not necessarily be in the way that we would expect it to be. It also, a theme is faith and integrity. So many rightfully look at this as a test. This is a test of Job's faith. Is he going to remain? Surprisingly, he does. We would expect, had anybody else that faces all this, we would expect them to curse God and die, as was suggested to Job to do. That's what we expect. But Job remains steadfast in his faithfulness to God, which culminates in his full and more than that restoration. He faces devastating circumstances. Yeah. They certainly can. Testing certainly can lead us to more trust in the Lord. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily a given. I would say that would be one of the goals of testing, is that we have more faith and more confidence and more trust in the Lord. And I believe that would be how Job would end. Is it a part of faith? Yes. Yeah. Correct. It is. Another theme within Job is that of divine sovereignty and human wisdom. Some interpreters focus on some of the wording and how God speaks as to God's absolute sovereignty, his unbreakable rule over any and all events and things. So some people focus heavily on that within the book of Job. On the other hand, we also recognize that there are human limitations in our situations. Little that Job could do in spite of this circumstance. And as part of the wisdom literature within the Bible, in a way, Job does explore the depths of the human quest for meaning in the face of all of life's complexities. Number 4, the mystery of God's ways. Similar to divine sovereignty, the cycle of speeches back and forth, and then God's response to them. Those suggest to us that God's ways are often very mysterious to us. And they're beyond our comprehension. As much as we want to figure it out, as much as we try to figure out what God's trying to do, we can't always. And so we must eventually concede that our wisdom is limited in comprehending God's divine purpose in circumstances. And finally, there's a theme of restoration and redemption. The conclusion of Job provides the godly person a hope that the promises of divine redemption will be carried out. Maybe not in this life, whereas Job was redeemed and he saw redemption and restoration in this life. That's not necessarily the case for us, per se. But we are promised that if we endure the suffering here, if we endure the trials here, we will be rewarded there. So whether or not we face any kind of restoration here, God will restore us there. Job's story also highlights and calls on us to be empathetic toward those who suffer. It challenges us to respond compassionately toward people that are suffering. Naturally, the natural man wants us to respond in judgment of those who are suffering. Oh, they must have done something that's causing them to be judged. Oh, they probably deserve whatever they're going through. But when we look at the story of Job and realize Job didn't deserve any of this that happened to him, we can look at it and say, oh, and then we see how God responds with compassion. We can understand, oh, we should be compassionate toward those that are suffering, because it's not necessarily that they did something wrong, it's just simply they are suffering. So those are some various themes within Job. Number 4, misunderstandings that are addressed in Job. Misunderstandings that are addressed in Job. In other words, there are multiple misconceptions, misunderstandings that we still have today, that the narrative presented in Job challenges those and helps us understand what is truly correct and what is truly right in God's economy. Those misunderstandings, first one would be this: suffering is a direct result of personal sin. That is challenged in Job. The misunderstanding is that if you are going through suffering, you are being punished for some kind of sin that you have committed. That's not necessarily the case, because it's obvious that it's addressed that Job is a truly righteous man. He suffers great calamity at the hands of Satan himself. Thus we immediately understand, wait, if he's suffering and it wasn't the result of his own personal sin, well, we can't say that everyone's suffering is a result of personal sin. Number two, retribution theology is how God operates. That is a misunderstanding. So retribution theology teaches that God operates in a manner such that good is always rewarded and evil is always punished. Therefore, those that do good must be good. Those that do evil must be evil. That is retribution theology. Good rewarded, bad punished. Job's friends seem to espouse this theory, and they tell him, they're like, you had to have, there's got to be something that you have done to cause all of this to happen to you. But the ability to have an outside view of Job's suffering, looking from 30,000 feet at Job's suffering and realize, oh, that's not right. Good people aren't always rewarded. Evil people aren't always punished. They will be, but... I'm trying to get across to my husband. He thinks God is just preaching. Today I'll be good, tomorrow, like... Correct. No, that's a very common thought pattern within the world. God's response and Job's experience show us that divine justice is much more complex than simply doing good and committing evil. Number three, misconception. Prosperity is a sign of righteousness. Amazingly, that's still present today, all over the place. I'm prospering, so that must mean I'm being righteous. I must be doing good. And of course, we have that within the health and wealth gospel teachers and everything like that. Prosperity gospel. There you go. That's right. It's even in the word. Job's initial prosperity and then subsequent suffering, despite his righteousness, show us this: material wealth and health are not reliable indicators of one's moral and spiritual state. Number four, humans can fully understand the divine. We've kind of glanced at this, but the pride of humans is that we are like gods. Think back to the serpent's original temptation. Oh, you'll be like gods. In our arrogance, we often think God owes us an explanation regarding why he did this or how he did X, Y, and Z. God's speeches to Job emphasize we are created and were created with limitations to our human understanding and knowledge, and therefore some of creation and the way that God governs are beyond our comprehensions. And so therefore, at some point in time, we're going to have to stop and say, I don't know. The Bible tells me this. I can have full confidence in God, but I'm not able to fully understand it and comprehend it, but I'm going to rely on God in it. Number five, misunderstanding is that God causes our suffering. The divine determinist is one that says that God is the cause of all things. And while, yes, in a way I understand that, God is the cause of all things, in that he started the world and all that is therein, and therefore, because of that, he is, in a way, the cause of all things. The divine determinist would go a step farther, stating that God is the determiner of all actions, all the thoughts and all the deeds of every person, good, bad, evil, etc. All of those are caused and determined by God. When taken to its logical end, we understand this to mean that we're merely puppets simply acting out his cruel and unusual script. Now, I agree. I know I'm painting with a large brush on determinism there. There's different degrees to it, and I understand that. But Job addresses the fact that God does not necessarily cause all of our sufferings. Did God cause Job's? No. Satan brought that upon him. God allowed it, because Satan couldn't get to Job without going through God. So God did allow it, but God was not the cause of it. Job addresses the fact of God causing our suffering in that God caused none of Job's suffering. Instead, what we see God do is be compassionate. He is merciful to Job, and he only permits the devil to go so far in his persecution of Job.
So he knows what we can handle?
Yes, correct, he does.
My mother was born with acute depression. Made a statement one time, I think God is giving me one more life.
And if we have more than we can handle, that's again a sign that we are human and we must rely on God. So, number 6 misunderstanding, we have no right to question God. Some people espouse that we have no right to question God whatsoever at any point in time, and that questioning God is often seen as a lack of faith on our behalf. But asking questions is natural. Asking questions is okay. Asking questions is good. Job's questioning, Job's lamentations are presented as part of his genuine struggle with faith and understanding and this deep, deep well of suffering that he is in. God never rebukes Job for questioning him. Now, Job is rebuked for presuming to understand God's mind, but he is not rebuked for questioning God and asking why. And overall, a lesson we must understand as we study the book of Job is this. We're reading a very ancient book with very modern day eyes. So we have to be careful because there's foreign terms, there's things that are worded in a way that we don't understand. It's strange to understand it. We don't understand in a vacuum. We understand within the context of what's going on. And so, and that's especially kind of difficult within Job, simply because we don't know when it was necessarily written. We don't know what year it took place. We don't know these things, and so it's kind of difficult to shape it around that, so we must be very careful on that. So, I'll call all that the preliminary stuff. And number 5, I want us to look at this. Discovering who Job was. Discovering who Job was. Because Job is only mentioned a couple other times in Scripture, and he's never mentioned in relation to who he was, who his relatives are, there's been a lot of various speculations about whether or not Job was actually someone else that's identified in Scripture. It's not uncommon for people to have and be known by multiple names. If you think of Peter in the New Testament, he's known as Peter, he's known as Simeon, he's known as Simon, he's known as Simon Peter, he's known as Cephas. So he's known by all these different names. And so it's not uncommon, especially as you go through, you find out, oh, so-and-so's here, you think it's a different person. You're like, oh, that's actually so, that they're the same person. So some think that it's possibly that this is who Job was. Options that have been made. There's a minority view that Elihu himself was actually Job. Just it was an alternate persona of him, and it's Elihu being Job in his mind. So it's kind of arguing against himself and responding to himself. The battle of the mind, I guess you could say. It's not a very popular view, but it is a view that it is Elihu. There's another minority view that Job is Melchizedek from Genesis 14, and then later would be in Hebrews. Now that's very speculative, and it really is only based on roles of righteousness and suffering, and I think we can understand when we get to Hebrews, I don't think there's any real merit to this one or ability to stand on this one exactly. Some scholars and traditions consider the possibility that Job is Heman the Ezrahite, who's mentioned in 1 Chronicles 2:6. Heman is also known as a man known for his wisdom, known for great suffering, and so he's very similar to Job, and so it's possible that Heman is just another name for who Job was. I mentioned before, Jobab in Genesis 33, or 36:33, 1 Chronicles 1:14. Now, this Jobab is Esau's grandson, and the association that is there is due to the fact of the similarity in names, Jobab, Job, and the fact that both are described as incredibly wealthy and influential figures. And when you look at Job down in verse 3, it says that this man was the greatest of all the men of the East. Now, when you get to Esau's grandson, it talks about him as reigning, almost like a king in some respect. And so with Job, with this much wealth and everything like that, it's possible that he was some sort of kingly figure in the land of Uz. And so there's that possible connection. Another connection, alternative, is there's another man by the name of Jobab mentioned in Genesis 10:29, and this is the great-great-great-grandson of Shem. His father was Joktan, and his uncle was, who we know more often, Peleg. And we're told that during the days of Peleg is when the earth was divided. That's when the Tower of Babel occurred. And so if that's true, that would have meant that Job was actually alive before Abraham. And when I looked at the timeline that I have, is about 40 or something so years that Job was alive before, or died before Abraham came on the scene. So that's an option. Others propose that Jethro, also known as Reuel, who was the priest of Midian and became Moses' father-in-law, they proposed that possibly that this was Job because of the phenomenal control Jethro had, and he was a wilderness figure, and he was out there, and he had all these lands, and he acted as the priest for these people, and the similarities and the wisdom that they provide, his status as a non-Israelite figure, all those play significant roles in people believing that it could be Jethro. So those are some options on who it is, and of course, the majority view would simply be that Job is Job. He is no one else. He's simply himself. And we have no reason to think otherwise. All those connections are really based just simply on nuance and various reasonings back and forth. They could be true. I'm not going to say that they can't be true, but we don't have any true hard evidence that points us that direction. Now, the reality of discovering who was Job is that it really doesn't matter as much as discovering who Job was. It doesn't matter who was Job as much as it matters who Job was. Verse 1 again says, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. Now, I failed to get my little pointer thing, but if you see on the map over here, you got multiple options. So Uz is a very tricky part because it's mentioned a couple other times in Scripture, but the biblical narrative here doesn't really concern itself with explaining how this is all interconnected and everything like that. Best we understand, the land of Uz is somewhere in Arabia. Now, over on the far side there, you can see where Babylon is. That would be the land of Chaldea. There's two groups mentioned in the devastation that comes upon Job. The Chaldeans come from the east. The Sabians come from the south. So the Sabians, if you were to follow the map all the way down toward the south, I believe that's where Yemen and Somalia are, if I remember right in geography. So if you were to keep going all the way down to the end of the peninsula there, you would have where the Sabians would come from. Elsewise, it's told us that the wind comes from the wilderness and smites the four corners of the house of his children, and the house falls on them. Obviously, we understand this area of Arabia to be extreme wilderness all over the place. So the south wind of Arabia coming across the desert up into Israel, I think we looked at that a couple months back. It was mentioned about the south wind coming up. So somewhere in this area is the region of Uz. Now, in Jeremiah 25, Jeremiah prophesies about the judgment of God that was going to come upon various nations and places. He specifically says in there that judgment is going to come on all the kings of all the land of Uz. And he includes in that list Egypt, the Philistines, which would be just west and south of Jerusalem area. And then Edom is included in there, and Moab is included in there, both of which you can see on the map there to the south and east of Jerusalem. And then when we come to Lamentations 4, it suggests to us, based on the wording there, it mentions the land of Uz again, and it seems to suggest that the land of Edom was in the land of Uz. So, all that to say this is that Job took place in an area somewhere around this map frame, relatively close to where Abraham and Israel and all of this was taking place. So, that's the location that it's taking place at. Now, the real crux of Job is told to us there at the end. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was perfect and upright, and one that feared God and eschewed evil. Perfect or blameless or upright. So, I got a quote here from the Expositor's Bible Commentary. It says that Job was blameless and upright should not be construed to imply he was sinless. The former, from the root be complete, usually refers to a person's spiritual maturity and the integrity of his inner being. The latter, meaning straight, right, is used in many contexts dealing with the human behavior that is in line with God's way. Together, they provide an idiomatic way to describe Job's high moral character. In other words, these first two help us to note and understand the way in which Job lived his life. He was perfect. Not that he was sinless, but he was perfect in that he realized he was complete. He was fully fulfilled in God. He needed nothing more than, nothing less than God. And obviously this led into clearly understanding that he saw no need to engage in the immorality of the world that was offered to him. Thus it said that he lived a straight life. He lived a right and correct life in a manner in which, kind of like when we studied Titus, the qualifications of the pastor, that there might be no credible accusation of sin against them in their life. So if he was perfect and upright, that leads us to ask why. What led Job to decide to take this path in life? Why is it that Job lived this way? And that's answered by the very next thing, that Job feared God. He was filled with an awe of the understanding of God's holiness. Thus he respected that holiness by living holy. Now, we don't know, how did Job come to know God? Especially if he lived before Abraham. I mean, if he was a contemporary of Abraham. All these various potentials of where he could have been from. We don't know how he came to know God, but we do know this. He truly knew God. He definitely knew God because he feared God. He reverenced God. God says in Job 28:28, and unto man, God said, he said, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding. So, here we are presented in verse 1. Job was a wise man. He feared God. He understood. He was a man of understanding. He eschewed, he shunned, he pushed away evil. Now, I put this sentence together. What is the fear of the Lord? The fear of the Lord is to understand and stand in awe and respect of God's holiness. But then to apply that knowledge by living a life that reflects God's holy character. That is the fear of the Lord. Which is why we see the final statement in verse 1 stating that Job eschewed evil, or he shunned, he avoided. When he was confronted with evil that he could not avoid, it was his common practice to turn away from evil, to leave it behind. I like the way that a man named Barry Webb summarized these 4 notes about Job. He says that the first 2 statements are generalizations about Job. If we were to look at him, we'd look at him and we'd see that's a perfect man, a blameless man, one that avoids evil and whatnot, but he's also an upright man. He lives a correct and righteous life. And those would be generalizations of him. The why of those generalizations would then be the vertical dimension, and that is that he feared God. And because of the vertical dimension of fearing God, then the horizontal dimension, the ethical part of his life, is that he lived out his vertical relationship to God was lived out horizontally in that evil was discarded, pushed away, turned away, always avoided, always shunned. It's pretty phenomenal character. Certainly character that we would desire to be said of us. That we are people who live perfectly, blamelessly. We are upright. We live straight. We live correct. We fear God. We know who God is. We respect who God is. And we live life eschewing evil. Because we fear God, we live out a holy lifestyle, presenting God's character to the world. Now, the facts of verse 1 make it very clear to us that what Job is about to go through has nothing to do with sin. This was not a punishment because of some terrible sinful mistake that Job made. This will become even more evident, of course, when we get to the next couple verses where we find out it was simply all a trap of the devil. It was all a plan by the devil to steal away one of God's righteous. Also, the facts of verse 1 make it clear to us that you can be the most pious, the most upright person, the most genuinely holy person that lives on planet Earth, and you will still face and can still face the greatest difficulties of the greatest magnitude ever known to any human being on earth. It's not that only the wicked suffer, but that all humans suffer under the curse of sin. Now, continuing on into verses 2 and 3, we're told that there were born unto him 7 sons and 3 daughters, and his substance also was 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels and 500 yoke of oxen, 500 she-asses, and a very great household, so that this man was the greatest of all the men of the east. Now, again, this is the calculation of how they would measure wealth back in that day. It wasn't how much physical money you had, but it was the accumulation of all the animals and the household goods and the number of people who counted on you and your estate for their life and their sustenance. I mean, if you consider the number of the animals here and the sheer amount of work that would go into feeding and caring for these animals in a rather desert climate for the most part, that's a lot. He needs a lot of land to do all this. The one commentator noted that he had 500 yoke of oxen. In other words, when you yoke oxen together, that was for plowing the fields. That was for tilling the fields. In other words, he didn't simply just have animals that he did. He was also a crop grower and grew massive quantities of crops. A very great household notes that he had many, many servants, not necessarily slaves, although it could have been, I suppose, but he had people that worked for him and under him, and he was responsible for feeding these people, such that he is known through the land as the greatest of all the men of the East. However, these truths about Job, this great wealth, this obviously massive store of goods that he had on hand in order to feed his animals and to be prepared for the future to feed his animals, all that wealth, all that store of goods, the massive number of people that he commanded and sat over, none of that could insulate Job from all catastrophe. A lesson gained from Job is that you can be the greatest man of all time, you can have all the wealth of any person ever, but as perfectly prepared as you may be for the future, as great of a prepper as you could be for the future and all the calamities that could come down the line, none of us truly know the future. None of us know what tomorrow is going to hold and how it's going to transpire, and therefore we should not trust in our riches. We cannot trust in our possessions and our material goods and our status in life. Why? Because they will all fail us. They can all fail us just as they failed to protect Job from these terrible tragedies. However, if that is then true, we should then trust God. Because God did not fail Job. God has not failed anyone. And God is not going to start failing anyone. in all that Job went through, God never once left Job's side. We never read that God left Job and walked away from him. In fact, my suspicion is this, that if God had not been beside Job, Job would probably never have made it through that trouble as he did. We learn further in verses 4 and 5 that his sons went and feasted in their houses, every one his day, and sent and called for their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And it was so, when the days of their feasting were gone about, that Job sent and sanctified them, and rose up early in the morning, and offered burnt sacrifices, according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my sons have sinned, and cursed God in their hearts." Thus did Job continually. So these verses help us place Job prior in the timeline to Moses, or at least outside of that, because at that point the law had been given with Moses, or I should say the later part of Moses anyway. The Aaronic, the Levitical system has been established. If Job lived on the opposite side of the world, if we didn't have evidence that the land of Uz was somewhere near Israel, like if Job lived in present-day New York, back 4,000 BC or whatever, 3,000 BC, it would be one thing to be like, okay, yeah, he's obviously very far separated from Israel. It's pretty obvious that he probably wouldn't have gotten the information from Israel about the Levitical system and all these things. We could make that assumption. But because we do know that the land of Uz was relatively situated really close to Israel, and that fact that Job is the greatest of all men of the East, Job probably has a pretty good idea on what's going on. So it's likely that Job lived before the law, based on what he's doing. But verses 4 and 5 tell us some beautiful truth about Job. Now, we don't know, it doesn't make it clear to us what was going on in verse 4 and whether this was a good thing or bad thing, an evil thing or not an evil thing. We don't know if his sons and daughters followed God. Some argue that this points to lackluster faith in their feasting and that they were simply relying upon themselves. And thus Job's fear is that during these times of feasting, they may have led to reliance on themselves and not on God, and thus they ignore God and they basically worship themselves. It could be these times of feasting were simply just times of rejoicing in God, how God had blessed them. It's not really clarified clearly for us. You recall how Israel later on would get together for feast and do all these things, and they'd sacrifice in certain things. But we do read of times that they would get together for these feasts, but they wouldn't do all the other stuff. They'd just kind of use these times of gathering together just to gather together and talk about how great they were and how good Israel had done and all these different things. And so it's possible that that's what's going on. We don't know for sure. I would suspect, and one commentator pointed out, that if the text is trying to point out that his sons went and feasted and what they were doing was evil activities in their feasting, it would be pretty weird for them to go call their sisters to come join in their illicit, weird, evil things. It doesn't sound right. So I would be surprised if that's what was going on there, but it's possible, I suppose. Either way, what we are taught here is that Job acts as the priest for his family. As the head of the family, as the patriarch of the family, he recognized his responsibility because I know God, I love God, I am fearing God, and I am avoiding evil. In my position as the head of this household and family, I am responsible for my children in a way. Obviously, they are responsible in and of themselves, but he still acted as the priest in an era in which there was no world in which we live in today where we are simply the priest. We go to God. We go to Jesus Christ, the priesthood of all believers, as we call it when we looked at the Baptist distinctives. As the priest of his family, Job showed deep respect and honor toward God, recognizing that God deserved to be honored with the goods. And one commentator went into, I don't have them, but the sheer amount of work and effort and time that would go into, and the amount of wealth that would go into burnt offerings for all of himself, all of his family. If he did it for just them, I'm guessing he probably did it for his wife. He probably did it for grandchildren. He possibly did it for his servants. It could go on, and the amount of wealth that he could expend on a continual, regular basis to show honor to God was phenomenal. F.B. Meyer stated it this way: "What a beautiful example is furnished by Job to Christian parents. When your girls are going among strangers and your boys into the great ways of the world, and you are unable to impose your will upon them, as in the days of childhood, you can yet pray for them, casting over them the shield of intercession with strong cryings and tears. They are beyond your reach, but by faith you can move the arm of God on their behalf." That's in essence what Job was doing, moving God's arm on their behalf. And so, as we journey through Job, I'm going to give you homework each week. The homework for this week, and the homework for every week, is simply going to be to read the next passage that we're going to go through next week. Now, there's a lot of repetition in Job, and we're trying to get through it in 13 weeks. And so therefore, we're probably not going to read every single verse as we go along. And if we try to break it down like we broke down Jude last year, we went 25 verses, 15 or 16 lessons or something like that, through the book of Job. If we tried to do that, we'd be here till the end of time trying to go through the book of Job. And I know somebody that is preaching through the book of Job, and I think they spent a whole year in the first chapter of Job. Like 50-something sermons in, I don't know. But anyway, we're not going to do that. So, your homework for this week is simply to read chapter 1, verse 6, through chapter 2, verse 13, which is the end of chapter 2. And then as we go along, we'll be reading bigger sections sometimes, shorter sections sometimes, and whatnot. So it's good to read it and understand it. If you have any questions that arise from your reading, free feel to come with those questions. Maybe we'll deal with them during the lesson. I don't know for sure. We may have time to deal with them afterward. Otherwise, if you have a question and you want to write down that question and it's not dealt with during the lesson, you can give it to me. I will formulate an answer for you and then give you the answer at the beginning of the next week's lesson. That way you have the answer to your question and whatnot. So just work through the chapter 1 and 2 basically, and just consider it and mull over it. That way you have a little bit of an idea of where we're going next week when we come back. So let's go ahead and pray, and then we'll be dismissed.